Okay, so Carol asked me to speak a little bit about how I initiate safety planning with our callers, as well as kind of the step by step process I use to go through safety planning. Um, and I created a little script that I will share with you guys as well. But as I was writing the script, I realized that safety planning is so determined on case by case situation, and it's really difficult to create like a generic scenario because safety planning is so individualized. So I thought that I would create a video and maybe just walk through a little bit of my thought process that kind of goes along with the script that I tend to use, or kind of the way that I choose to navigate safety planning. So usually I like to go through the safety, obviously we go through the safety assessment first, and I like to fill that out the best that I can, learn as much as I can about this person. But I also keep in mind that during safety planning, and during the creation of the safety plan, I'm going to learn a lot more information about that person. So if I have a hard time, asking one of the questions, or one of the questions just doesn't feel like it fits in with the conversation, sometimes I'll skip that from the assessment and then get the answer during safety planning. One of those that I commonly do is substance use, which I know that we're not technically supposed to do that, but I kind of incorporate that into the way that I talk about coping, and then I ask that just so it flows with conversation more, because it can be very harsh and abrupt to be like, do you use substances? Are you currently using any substance? Usually it just doesn't follow the conversation well, or at least for me. So sometimes I'll leave that out of the assessment and ask that during safety planning. But when I'm done creating the safety assessment and I've kind of gone through most of those questions, and that conversation is starting to die a bit, I'll state a transitional statement, something of the sort of, typically at this point in the call, we like to transition into completing a safety plan. I always like to ask if that's something they're familiar with, or if they have a safety plan, because that kind of dictates the way that I continue the call. So if a caller is like, no, I have no idea what a safety plan is, I'm going to spend a little bit more time explaining what a safety plan is, what it can be used for, when it can be used, all of those things. Whereas if a caller has a safety plan or has done safety planning in the past, then I don't need to go into as much detail. So typically, if a caller will say no, I will break down kind of what safety planning is. And I usually say something along the lines of, safety planning is a great tool that we can use when we're having really intense emotion. I tend to leave out just the suicide, because I think safety planning can be used for anxiety attacks, a state of deep depression, or any other mental health symptoms as well. So I usually stray towards, those hard emotions, and then I'll throw the thoughts of suicide in there. So I'll say something like, a safety plan can be really great in helping guide you through dealing with really hard emotions, or some of those suicidal thoughts that we've discussed earlier. So it can be a really great tool to use. I do encourage callers to write down their safety plan as we go, and I often suggest that they do it either on a piece of paper somewhere that they can access easily, or that they do it in their notes section, just encouraging them to write it down in a place that they can access in a split second, and explaining to them, a safety plan can be utilized throughout the day in any of these circumstances. When you start to have more intense emotion, it's basically just a guide on how to process those emotions, work through them, and how to handle that situation, no matter where you're at or what you're doing. So that's why it can be helpful to have the safety plan on your phone or somewhere super accessible. And then I give them a minute to ask questions if they have questions. And I also tend to, say, when just let me know when you're ready, or when you have a piece of paper or you have your notes out, and then we'll begin. Once they confirm that they are ready and that they have somewhere to kind of write this stuff down, I start saying something along the lines of, so with safety planning, I like to break it down into a step-by-step process. And the first step we're going to talk about is going to be warning signs. And these are going to be your identifiers, indicators, that you need your safety plan. So identifying what those warning signs are is going to help you identify when you need a safety plan and when you need to utilize your safety plan. So it's important to be able to identify what those warning signs are so you know when to turn to your safety plan. Sometimes I'll explain it as, your warning signs are going to be like a light bulb going off in your brain that you need to pull out a safety plan, or that you're going to need more support than what you currently have. So then I'll start talking about warning signs. I'll be like, so warning signs is going to be the first step of a safety plan, and I explain what a warning sign is. So a warning sign is anything that you think, feel, or do as these intense emotions are starting to develop. And I word it that way to encourage people to think about it in terms of, this doesn't just have to be suicide. And then I always add that in at the end by saying, these are things that you think, feel, or do as these intense emotions are starting to develop that might lead to suicidal thoughts, right? Because it usually starts with these intense emotions and progresses into those suicidal thoughts. So then we start listing off, like, I always ask, what are some of those warning signs that you can identify? If a caller is kind of stuck or doesn't really know, I tend to go back up to either the mental status and current functioning assessment, or use some of the stuff that we've already talked about in conversation. And so, one caller that I had was saying that they had an increase in crying lately. They were more irritable, they were temperamental, they were having panic attacks. So those were things that I encouraged them to write down as warning signs. And so we had, talked about feelings of self-hate, increase in crying. They had stated that they were yelling more often, having emotional shutdown, feelings of isolation triggered thoughts of suicide or some of these more intense emotion. They had identified, that they had a fear of being stuck and feeling unheard. Those were all things that we put down in the warning signs. And I kind of walk through that with the caller. So sometimes, the caller will just list them out, and that's great, and it's done. Other times, I have to do a little bit more guiding. And that would look like, okay, so you said that you experience anxiety or panic attacks. What does that typically look like for you? Do you experience shortness of breath? Do you experience shakiness? Those things would be warning signs. So it's also an opportunity to educate our callers on what warning signs are and what those things, to reflect on what those things are in their body, in their mind, like what is my trigger? What are those things that happen before I start to have suicidal thoughts? And sometimes, and usually, that is probably one of the longer conversations that occurs, and I give them the space to do that. And I always go back and reiterate. So when there's silence, I'll say, okay, is there anything else that you can think of that you start to feel or you start to do as these thoughts are starting to develop, or as you're starting to have these emotional, really hard emotions? Once we're done with warning signs, I often explain the light bulb thing, and then I'll say, okay, so we're going to move into step 2, and step 2 is going to be your coping strategies. These are going to be anything that you can do on your own to help you feel better momentarily. I explained that coping strategies aren't always going to be a quick fix. It's not going to make the emotion go away. It's not going to make the feelings go away. It's going to provide momentary comfort, which might lead to a re-regulation, which leads to those things going away. But utilizing a breathing strategy, for example, isn't necessarily going to completely remove the anxiety that you are feeling. It's going to momentarily relax you, right? And I always make sure with coping strategies that as we're going through this, that listing off things that are appropriate for the things that they're experiencing and things that are going to work for them. I think we get really stuck in the excuse me, traditional coping. Like, this is what these are the 5 traditional coping strategies, right? Like journaling, this and that, breathing exercises, the things that we're taught in school, right? But coping can be anything. It can be finding a shiny rock on the floor that has texture and feeling it. It can be taking a shower. It can be getting your nails done. It can be self-care. It can be preventative. There's preventative coping strategies, things that you do every day, routinely. And then there are things that you do in the moment when you're having these intense emotions that help you process through what's happening. And I often split it that way as well. Like, what are some of the things that you do on a routine basis that help you feel better versus what you do in the moment when you might be having a panic attack? And so with this specific caller, they had identified breathing strategies. I asked, specifically, do you have a specific one that you use, or do you tend to just try to focus on your breathing?